ADHD is a congenital, genetic, neurologic condition. Congenital means you have it from early in life. If some symptoms are not present by the age of 12, the likelihood is you don't actually have ADHD. It's a genetic condition, an hereditary condition. You get this from your folks. The vast majority of ADHD has this genetic basis, and the genetic basis is made up of many different genes, each contributing some small part. And exactly what your ADHD looks like, exactly how it responds to different medications, is all determined by which particular genes of ADHD you happen to have. There are other things that have been associated with ADHD. They contribute to only a small number of the total cases, but things like prematurity and what can be associated with ADHD. And when we're talking about prematurity, we're not talking about a baby born a week or two early. We're talking about a baby born 6 to 12 weeks early. And these babies do have a somewhat increased incidence of ADHD. When mothers smoke during pregnancy, there's an increased incidence of ADHD. Some of the other factors that you can get into in pregnancy, such as alcohol and certain other drugs, can be associated with some ADHD in the offspring. If there's some brain injury, and that brain injury can be a traumatic injury, it can be from infections such as meningitis or encephalitis, or it can be from some toxin, lead poisoning or mercury poisoning. But all of those things can cause some damage to the brain that can look a lot like ADHD. ADHD is a biologic, physiologic, neurologic condition. It is part of the hardwiring of the brain. The one thing that attention deficit hyperactivity disorder clearly is not, is it is not a disorder. If you have ADHD, you don't have a disease, you don't have a disorder, there's nothing wrong with you. What you do have is a different way of processing information. And if you would like to be successful in life, you have to do precisely the same thing that every other human being on this planet needs to do to be successful. You need to recognize and develop your strengths, and you need to find ways of overcoming your weaknesses, just like everybody else. Now, ADHD is a complex condition, and we're not going to talk about it in all of its neurophysiologic glory. What I'm going to do is simplify this in a way that makes it very easy to understand what we're really talking about. I like to think of the brain as having two sets of functions. One set of functions are the workstations of the brain. And the workstations of the brain include the frontal cortex, that does the thinking. It includes the occipital cortex for vision. It includes the auditory cortex for language and speech. It includes the motor cortex to run and jump and chase your sister. Insofar as we know, children with ADHD have perfectly good working brains. As a group, they have the same strengths and limitations as any other group of children. The second part of the brain is a complex network, which for lack of a better term, I'm going to refer to here as the control sections. And it is the control sections that will determine which workstation is going to work and which workstation is going to take a break. You can't do everything at once. You can't ride your bike and talk to grandma on the phone and do math homework and play basketball all at the same time. You have to turn some things off and turn other things on. That's a function of the control section. If you're going to turn a workstation on, you have to determine how high you're going to turn it. If you're going to go from here to the end of the block, are you going to walk to the end of the block, or jog to the end of the block, or sprint to the end of the block? A control section function. And finally, if you're going to have that workstation working really efficiently, you better damp down all of the other workstations. Again, a function of the control section. We have now very good physiologic information that tells us that those people who are clearly identified as ADHD, when you look at their brains, what you see is that the activity of those areas that we know to be the control sections function consistently at a relatively low level of metabolic activity. Essentially, the level of activity that most people's brains function at when we're asleep. So suddenly we have a new concept of ADHD. Here's a child with a perfectly good working brain, but it's like the man at the controls is asleep at the switch. There's nobody in there to run that show. There's nobody in there to say, okay, brain, here's what we have to do, here's how we're going to do it, here's when it has to get done, go. that part of the brain is napping. If we understand this, we begin to understand why we treat this condition the way we do and why that treatment is so successful. We treat ADHD with stimulant medication. Now, giving a stimulant to some of the hyperactive little children that we see is intuitively just about the dumbest thing you could do, but it works. And it works not because, as we used to believe, that there's something wrong with the brain and the medication has a paradoxical and opposite effect. It works because we have a normal brain and the medication works precisely as advertised. It works as a stimulant, but what it specifically stimulates are the control sections. It wakes up your brain. It puts you back in charge of your own brain. And I will tell you, after many years of doing this kind of work and seeing thousands of children with ADHD, what I find is that so many of these children have so many capabilities, so many strengths, that if we put them back in charge of their brain, we have a dynamite child. And that is certainly the goal that I have for every patient I see. Now, there's another way to look at ADHD as well, and it's valuable to do this as well. And this is the neurochemical approach. The human brain, well, let me show you my model of the human brain. I'll show you what this is all about. There it is. That's my model of the human brain. We have here two nerves. We have the green nerve and we have the red nerve. They're separated by a tiny little gap. The way this works is that if we stimulate the green nerve at one end, we're going to have an electrical impulse traveling down the axon, the length of that nerve. As that impulse gets to the end of the green nerve, and that impulse is what the message is that green nerve is carrying. That message gets to the end of the green nerve. The question is, how does that message get across that gap to the red nerve? Turns out that at every nerve ending, there are little packets of chemicals, collectively called neurotransmitters, and there are dozens of neurotransmitters in the human brain, each one having a specific function and each one occurring at specific areas of the brain. But whatever neurotransmitter happens to be in that particular nerve ending, it's released into that little gap, and it takes just a fraction of a second before it hits the end of the red nerve. And when it hits the end of the red nerve, it's going to make the red nerve do something. It may make the red nerve fire an impulse and carry on the message. It may block the red nerve from carrying on the message, or it may change the red nerve in some way, but something's going to happen. Once that occurs, that chemical doesn't disappear. It gets pushed back into the synapse, and the green nerve has a mechanism for sucking it back up. That's why I made it a green nerve, because this is Oregon, we do recycling, and this seems very appropriate. Now, the neurotransmitters that we see in the control sections of the brain, there are basically two that we are dealing with. One is dopamine, the other is norepinephrine. And what it turns out is that these particular neurotransmitters in the ADHD brain are present, but present in a somewhat diminished amount. There's not quite as much as there is in the typical brain. Yep, it's not zero. Zero would be a hopeless case, but a little less than usual. So let's think for a moment what this will mean if you have a weak message coming down this pike. If you have a weak message, let's say, do your homework. The message goes down the green nerve, gets to the end of the green nerve, a little dopamine comes out. Bummer, there's not enough to trigger the red nerve, nothing happens. Dopamine gets sucked back up. Another weak message comes down the line. Do your homework. Same story, a little dopamine, not enough, gets sucked up, nothing happens. And this can go on for quite some time. If you want that message to get across more intensely, you have to make the message more intense. A message that would be more intense might sound something like, Mister, if that homework is not done by 8 o'clock tonight, you can forget about your weekend plans. Oh my God, my weekend plans. I'm going to be with my friends, we're going to have a great time, and you are ready to go get your homework whipped out. Or if the message begins as a very powerful message, a message like, play the new video game. Well, that message has no problem sending out enough chemical to transmit that message. But most of our lives are lived at the level of ordinary, not terribly interesting messages, and those have a great deal of difficulty being transmitted in the ADHD brain. Now, what does medication do to this? The role of medication is to block the reuptake mechanism in that green nerve. So now when you have a weak message, do your homework, there may not be enough dopamine to connect to the red nerve, but what is there doesn't get sucked back up, it stays in the synapse. When the next week message comes along, there may be a little bit more dopamine. And this will continue until finally the buildup is high enough that messages are getting sent. Doesn't take very long, by the way, but when this happens, now you're good to go. And as long as the medication remains in your system, you are focused, you're doing well. Eventually the medication wears off, it's metabolized, and you go back to your usual state. You're not better, you're not worse, you're back to your usual. The one thing that has changed, though, is whatever information, whatever skills you have learned while you are better focused, continue to be yours. You own those.